from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. This is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Presidents Biden and Putin meet in Geneva. The U.S. president says he warned his Russian counterpart against more cyber attacks on American infrastructure. We will have all the details and reaction from diplomatic and cyber experts. Plus, it's like walking into a dream. That description from the executive behind the new Google store in New York, set to open Thursday. We'll talk about the company's brick-and-mortar approach to selling more hardware and how it compares to Apple. And crypto is the next internet-sized opportunity for the United States. That nugget, plus many more from my latest Studio 1.0 with Coinbase co-founder Fred Ursum, now running the crypto investment firm Paradigm. We'll show you a preview. Those stories in a moment, but first, the U.S. market's digesting the latest Fed decision. Our Ed Ludlow has the latest. Ed, walk us through the decision and what it all means.
Yeah, a warning from Fed Chair Jay Powell that the dots should be taken with, quote, a big grain of salt after the dot plot did show 2 quarter basis point rise by the end of 2023. And the S&P 500, the main gauge of U.S. equities, falling by the most since March, in a month, but pairing some of those losses to close down 0.5%. The tech-heavy NASDAQ 100 also paired some of the losses that we saw in the wake of that Fed decision, led by names like Apple, Amazon, Tesla, that made actually pretty significant gains through Wednesday afternoon. The benchmark U.S. 10-year Treasury yield rising by 8 basis points. You can see the yield around 1.57%. And that move actually, the biggest move in yields on a closing basis for the 10-year since March the 12th. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index also seeing significant gains, the most since June of last year, up 1%, closing up around 0.8%. Really, the most impact was felt in the belly of the yield curve. This is the yield on the U.S. 5-year Treasury. You can see rising by more than 10 basis points following that Fed decision with a yield of 0.89%. This is where the market will see the most impact as well in terms of tapering. And there were some other asset classes I was looking at as well. Gold having a pretty interesting drop to a 4-week low. We know, of course, that the pathway for rate increases has been a topic of debate for the metals market. What was interesting, though, where there was less pronounced move, the crypto markets. Not much movement in Bitcoin. We saw the Bloomberg Galaxy Crypto Index already lower for most of Wednesday, not make any marked moves. And it's interesting to see the interplay between traditional assets and cryptocurrencies on a day where I know we're going to talk about it on the show. Emily.
Absolutely. Our Ed Ludlow. Ed, thanks so much for the roundup. Really important decision today. I do want to get now to the top story that Bloomberg has been all over all day. President Biden summit with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Human rights, cybersecurity, nuclear weapons, all big topics that were discussed. Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo has the latest from Geneva. So, Maria, walk us through the big takeaways so far. I know there are conflicting opinions about how much progress was made.
Yeah, look, and to go into this meeting, you have to factor and set the scene. You know, the expectations going into this were very, very low. You know, the two sides, both the United States and Russia, had said that the relationship was the lowest that it's been since the Cold War. So the expectations were very low. Now, coming out of this meeting, the two did agree to reinstate their ambassadors. That, as you know, in the diplomatic world and the world of politics, the diplomatic circles is seen as a sign of goodwill. It means that the two want to work together. And they also said there are areas in which they could see some common ground. They also said the talks were very frank and they were open, and to some extent they could help bridge some of those big differences. Now, what you do have to factor here, of course, is that the expectations were very low. And when you listen to that speech from Vladimir Putin coming out of this meeting, he was sticking very much to what is a standard Russian line, saying anything that we're accused of, the United States does it too when it comes to Alexei Navalny. As you know, that is the opposition to Putin, who was poisoned, and he was taken to Germany for treatment and then arrested as soon as he got back to Russia. He said that this was an internal matter and he would not go further than that. And of course, when you look at cybersecurity, which was something that for the U.S. delegation is key, you know, this affects the politics, but it also affects some of the companies and the corporates. You know, Vladimir Putin said, we're not responsible for this. A lot of the cyber attacks that we see are actually happening from the U.S. They come from the United States of America. So again, the breakthrough, I would argue, not a lot, but the goal here was to avoid an escalation in that very tense relationship, and to some extent, that is exactly what we got.
All right, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo on the ground in Geneva. We've been watching your reporting all day. Maria, thank you so much for bringing the highlights to us. I want to get to someone now who has experience working with Russia and engaging with Putin directly. I want to bring in former U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2014 to 2017, John Teff. John, thank you so much for joining us. So from what Maria said there, from what you've seen and heard about this meeting, was it a success or not?
Well, I think it's too early to say, Emily. I think what the president was trying to do was to lay a base here. He was trying to establish a diplomatic framework with which to deal with the Russians. I think the president made it pretty clear. He's pretty skeptical. He spoke candidly, as he told us, to Putin about a whole array of issues, some of which you've mentioned. But I think we're not going to know, as he said, for 3 to 6 months. What you saw today was a carefully scripted diplomatic strategy, which started last week with the G7 summit, continued through the NATO summit, the EU meetings, and then culminated today with the hope that perhaps there'll be something there. I was encouraged to see that they've got a group meeting on cyber. Obviously, no guarantees there. And it's pretty clear that from the conversations or from the statements that both of the presidents made in their press conferences, that there were some pretty tough words exchanged. That said, it was businesslike. Putin called it effective, constructive. And so I think we'll just have to see. It's too early to say how much success we'll have. Last point is that I think there's a lot of problems that obviously exist in the relationship. They're based on really different views, different interests, and obviously different values. We haven't seen Putin change much. In fact, he's gotten more repressive over the last year than he was before. So we should be skeptical. We should be careful and watch. But I think our president put it down as clearly as he could today, what the stakes are, and opened up possibilities for doing things that where we might have some mutual interest.
I want to talk about cyber specifically because this is happening against the backdrop of cyber attacks that have ratcheted up in severity over especially the last 6 months. We've interviewed expert after expert who has told us these attacks are coming from Russia. Russia is doing nothing to stop it. Do you expect to see any change in the pace of those attacks, the severity of those attacks as a result of what happened today, or not?
I think we can hope so. I think at one point in the several interviews that he had, that our president had after the meeting and after his own press conference, he said that he made it clear to Putin that the United States has cyber capabilities as well. And I think Putin clearly understands that. Now, there was no threats, and President Biden went out of his way to say he was not going to be threatening. But, the Russians understand that we have considerable cyber capabilities as well. Now, I'd like to think and hope that Putin will pick up the opportunity to look at these 16 areas which Biden proposed that we put out of bounds. But, there's no evidence to date that we should be overly optimistic, put it that way.
The U.S. cyber capabilities, does that mean that our offense is at the same level of their offense? Are we unleashing the same kind of attacks that the Russians seem to be unleashing on U.S. infrastructure, or is there a different state of play?
I don't know the answer to that question. Our cyber capabilities are something that are carefully monitored, and I am certainly not privy to those kind of things. What I read in the newspapers, just like you and your viewers read in the newspapers, is that we have considerable capabilities. Now, whether we would use those kinds of things, I just don't know. There have been stories that during the Trump administration, there were some use of cyber to send messages, in effect, to the Russians. But I have no inside knowledge on that.
Well, we're going to dive into that topic specifically with a former State Department and FBI expert later this hour. Meantime, John, what do you think the main value of this meeting is? And if there is progress, is this something that we could see in a matter of months? Is this something that will play out over years?
Emily, I think it's important that we look at this meeting as an attempt to put down a base, to put down a set of understandings, and also an effort by President Biden, and I'm sure Putin on his side, to put down clear markers. People talk a lot about deadlines, but I think this is in my experience, these summits are not just to sign agreements and are not just to come up with deliverables, as the State Department always calls them. But this was a chance for the two men, with their closest advisors, to sit down and review the bidding. And Biden hasn't been in power, obviously, since he left as vice president, and there's been a lot of things that have happened. So I, for one, am happy to see them sitting down and talking and communicating, hopefully setting up some additional meetings. But again, I'm as skeptical and careful about making any predictions. A lot depends on Putin now, but I think he understands better, going back to Moscow tonight, where Joe Biden stands on a whole array of these issues.
Right, and President Biden said earlier he is realistic, but also that a level of optimism was necessary and healthy. John Taft, former U.S. ambassador to Russia. John, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your perspective here. Meantime, a U.S. lawmaker says proposed new antitrust legislation would ban Apple from pre-installing apps on its devices. Democratic Representative David Cicilline says tech companies would be prohibited from giving an advantage to their own products under his plan. This means that Apple couldn't ship an iPhone or an iPad with pre-installed apps on its iOS operating system. The proposal is part of a package of bipartisan bills that would impose significant new constraints on how tech companies operate. All right, coming up, Zuck got chucked off the annual Glassdoor top CEO list. That is why the leader of Facebook didn't make it to the list for the first time in 8 years. That is next. This is Bloomberg. For the first time since 2013, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg failed to make it to Glassdoor's top CEO list. Glassdoor surveyed more than 700 Facebook employees between May 2020 and May of this year, and worker sentiment about Zuckerberg has declined significantly in that time, specifically in the last few months of 2020. Could it be due to Facebook's handling of the U.S. presidential election or misinformation around the COVID-19 pandemic? Glassdoor chief economist Andrew Chamberlain joins us now with more. So when it comes to Mark Zuckerberg, Andrew, what is the data telling you? What are workers saying?
It wasn't that long ago when Mark Zuckerberg was named #1 on this list of top CEOs from Glassdoor. That was 2013. He subsequently dropped into the 50s. And for the first time ever, he's dropped completely off the list this year. And basically what we found is that the relentless public scrutiny of Facebook's product and algorithms, combined with the election events of the past year, and it's just taken a toll. And normally what we find is when a company faces bad publicity, like Facebook has, internally employees rise to the occasion. It often galvanizes them to fix the problem and brings them together, and sentiment goes up. But it's just been so relentless with Facebook, especially after the January 6th Capitol insurrection, that it seems to have finally pushed Mark Zuckerberg off the list this year.
Interesting. We'll have to see what happens next year. #1 on the list was Rich Lesser of BCG. #2, and the top tech CEO on the list, was Adobe's Shantanu Narayan. What stands out about him?
So both Rich Lesser from Boston Consulting Group and Adobe, they have 99% approval ratings. Employees love them. In the case of Shantanu Narayan, people view him as putting employee health and safety first during the pandemic. Also, it's worth noting, a bunch of the tech companies that made the list this year, they are platforms like Slack, Adobe, Zoom. that have become essential during the work from home environment. And so I think that that has played a role as Shantanu Narayan has really stepped out front and led the way, turning their product into like an essential thing that's kept teams remotely working, not just another product.
Microsoft Satya Nadella, number 6, not bad. Tim Cook, number 32. He's the only CEO to be on the list for all 8 years. Talk to us about what's important here, what workers are telling you in the data as these companies like Microsoft, like Apple, like Adobe decide their return to work plans and workers are going through another major transition.
Yes, the common themes that unite all the winners are, first, a person that embodies a company's mission and really walks the talk of the company. Second is they practice transparent, consistent communication. They're in touch all the time, especially during times of uncertainty like this past pandemic year. And third, they're accessible and visible, as are their senior leaders. However, there's a fourth factor that really popped up this year, which was trust. Many people mentioned trust in these reviews of CEOs, and the CEOs putting employees first when they figured out how to navigate a recession and recovery. So I think that those are important lessons that we can learn from many of the leaders. And it's worth noting, although Mark Zuckerberg didn't make the list this year, no other social media CEO made the list either. So I think it's a sign of tumult during these difficult times that we didn't see any of them.
Well, and I should point out that Mark Zuckerberg still has an above-average approval rating. Based on your numbers, 88% approval. Yes. Average is 73%. But I wonder what somebody like Mark Zuckerberg or any of these leaders could take away from your findings here. As they decide their return to work plans, is there one right way? Are workers calling and asking for flexibility or more understanding? And if there is a, forced return to the office, does that mean these companies will lose people, or is there a vast contingent of people that want to go back to the office and have that in-person interaction?
These leaders we name are the best of the best, according to employees. So these 100 leaders really are the ones to watch if you're trying to figure out what the post-COVID workplace is going to look like. Our research shows people generally want flexibility, no question. It's just an issue of how much flexibility is compatible with making sure teams work together and still get their jobs done. One interesting finding is that many of the CEOs we named on this top award are not in New York and San Francisco or Chicago. They are spread out. There were 7 CEOs in Texas, 4 in Wisconsin, 3 in Florida, 3 in Utah. So if those CEOs lead the way by locating outside of the big metro areas, it may be a sign of the times that more flexibility, more work from home and remote work might be here to stay.
Interesting. Well, talent is everywhere as well. Andrew Chamberlain of Glassdoor. Fascinating to see the list shift from year to year. Thanks for bringing it to us. Meantime, Alphabet's self-driving car unit Waymo has raised $2.5 billion in a recent funding round. Among the investors, Andreessen Horowitz and the Canada Pension Plan. Questions have been raised about the unit's strategy and its competitive strength after losing 6 key executives since February, including the CEO and the CFO. Coming up, Google wants in on brick and mortar. The company cuts its first storefront ribbon Thursday, just a few blocks from Apple's New York City store. We're going to have all the details next. And as we head to break, Roblox took a tumble Wednesday. The video game company reporting a decline in bookings for the month of May compared to the previous month. Some analysts say it was worse than anticipated, but expect the numbers to get better in June. This is Bloomberg. Watch out, Apple. Well, maybe. Google is coming for your New York territory. Google will open its first retail store in Manhattan, highlighting the internet giant's effort to promote its consumer hardware devices. The store in Manhattan's trendy Chelsea neighborhood will open to the public Thursday. Let's bring in Bloomberg Tech's Nico Grant for more. So, Nico, Ivy Ross, who runs Google's hardware design and designed this store, said it's like walking into a dream. I suppose that depends on whose dream you're in, but will it live up to those expectations?
Well, it's certainly walking into her dreams, and she helped oversee the design of the store. You know, I think a lot of consumers are used to the Apple Store's aesthetic, which is very stark and has a lot of glass, white, and silver. The Google Store, by contrast, was designed to have very muted and neutral tones. And so the furniture is made of blonde wood, and it's made of cork by local artists in New York. They wanted the products to stand out, and it really feels like a social space with sofas and coffee tables and piles of books next to a speaker so that customers can see what Google's products might look like in their home.
Okay, so aside from cushy sofas, what kind of Google products will we find in the store, and will they be enticing enough to buy?
Well, you know, Google's hardware division, which has really been operating for 5 years now, has been fledgling to some extent. Of course, they make a lineup of phones called Pixel. They make Nest devices for the home. But, you know, they're not market leaders. They're actually far from it in both areas. And so you can buy all of those things. You can also buy third-party accessories for Google devices and Google swag, such as, you know, caps that say Google and T-shirts and dog toys and things of that nature. And if you have Google products already and they need to be serviced, you can bring them into the store, and Google will try to fix your devices same day, as well as exposing customers to a whole bunch of other technology in certain rooms that have various experiences.
So, quick question, will it compare to the Apple Store experience? You have 30 seconds.
Well, you know, Apple has a network, and this is just going to be a niche effort, even though it is in the middle of New York City. I think that it's going to be very interesting for Google fans and buyers and people who may have an open mind to it.
Okay, well, the beginning of something for sure. Bloomberg's Nico Grant, always good to have you, Nico. Thanks so much for that update. Coming up, we'll have more from the meeting of the presidents, Biden and Putin, sitting down in Geneva as hackers in Russia have ratcheted up attacks on prime U.S. targets. Will they ever end? That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Let's get back to the markets where Ed Ludlow has been keeping an eye on cybersecurity stocks. Ed, take it away.
Yeah, so President Biden brought up the issue of cybersecurity around the meeting with President Putin. We also saw pretty pronounced moves in cyber stocks lower after that Fed decision, but they bounced back. You can see the NASDAQ CTA Cybersecurity Index closing up. It's actually pushing to a fresh record high. Also, the BI Cybersecurity Peers Index closing up by 0.1% or so. But what's really interesting, over the last few weeks, cybersecurity has dominated the headlines, the news cycle. But you don't really see the same energy in equity markets. Here, this orange line is the NASDAQ 100, that sort of tech-heavy gauge. The white line is the NASDAQ CTA index. It's lagged behind. It's only recently that we've seen, over the last few days, gains in these cybersecurity stocks. The question is, when does investor psychology change? If you look at flows for ETFs that track cybersecurity stocks, this is actually a basket that BI, Bloomberg Intelligence, puts together. We saw outflows in April and May, but in June so far, inflows of almost $200 million. That's kind of interesting. Is it now changing that investors are taking cybersecurity more seriously? Emily.
All right, Ed, thank you. As Ed mentioned, cybersecurity top of mind, one of the most controversial topics during President Biden's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. President Biden outlining certain critical infrastructure was to be, quote, off limits.
Another area we spent a great deal of time on was cyber and cybersecurity. I talked about the proposition that certain critical infrastructure should be off limits to attack, period, by cyber or any other means. I gave them a list. If I'm not mistaken, I don't have it in front of me, 16 specific entities, 16 defined as critical infrastructure under U.S. policy. from the energy sector to our water systems.
Joining me now, Chris Painter, president at the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace and a former cyber diplomat. Chris, I have to say, you worked at the DOJ, the FBI, the National Security Council, the State Department, all on cyber. Do you think that the Russians will act as if anything is off limits?
Well, that's the real question. And as President Biden said, the proof will be in the pudding to see if they actually obey this. So far, no. They've already agreed in the UN, for instance, that critical infrastructure, countries shouldn't attack that in peacetime. And we're at peacetime now. And yet you see these incidents all the time, both by the Russian state and also by Russian actors in Russia, cyber criminals, where they're not taking any action. So yes, it's great to agree on things, but unless there's actually follow through and accountability and consequences, I don't think we're going to see a change.
So based on what you heard out of this meeting, what could President Putin do? What will he likely do when it comes to cyberspace?
Well, I think it's good they agreed to talk, at least at some lower level basis. I think there can be some things that are at least discussed between the two sides. However, I thought that perhaps President Putin, I thought there was a glimmer of hope that he might cooperate against these cyber criminal groups because they're not operating on his behalf. Now, sometimes they do, but in this case, on these ransomware cases, they don't seem to have recently, the Colonial Pipelines and other attacks. And as a show of good faith, he could say, I'm going to crack down on them. Now, you saw at his press conference, he just denied it was ever happening at all and said that most of the cyber activity was coming from the U.S. So that certainly was not a good sign. Again, we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and months. We'll see if he actually starts doing something. As you said, I was a prosecutor for a long time. I've dealt with Russia for a long time. They've never been that cooperative on cybercrime, but they are responsible when these actors are operating from their territory and causing things like the Colonial Pipelines attack.
So let's talk about responsibility, because Colonial Pipeline, JBS, the biggest meat processing plant in the United States, who is perpetrating the attacks? If we're saying it's hackers on Russian soil, how many of those attacks are actually happening on Putin's orders?
Well, there's a blend, right? There are times when non-state actors are operating at the Kremlin's direction. There are times when there's corruption or other things where they're turning a blind eye. At least the White House has so far said that these groups, the Colonial Pipelines hack and the JBS hack, were not state-sponsored, that these were criminal groups. So Chris Gray, the director of the FBI, said there were some connections between these groups and the Kremlin. But even if that's the case, imagine, and this is something Biden said, he said to Putin, imagine if hackers in Florida were attacking the gas industry and gas pipeline in Russia. And we said, hey, there's nothing we can do about it. Sorry. That's unacceptable. And so, the fact that they're using criminal groups doesn't mean they evade all responsibility.
So President Putin went to great lengths to say that the U.S. has its own cyber capabilities. Of course we do. But how are we using them? Of course we run our own offense. But how does the U.S. treat Russia in cyberspace? Are we perpetrating attacks against them that are anything on the level of what Russia seems to be doing to the United States?
No, look, there's a vast difference between intelligence gathering, which every country in the world does and will do from the beginning of time till the end of time, and these kind of more destructive attacks, election interference that was done in 2016 and again this past election. Big, what was called the NotPetya computer worm that, as you may recall, took Maersk, the giant shipping giant, offline and affected lots of commerce around the world. We don't do that kind of disruptive activity. And most recently, these criminal attacks that have taken down infrastructure in the U.S. and really brought home to people how important cybersecurity is. So there's a vast difference there.
Now, we've had guests on the show who have said, ultimately, we're at cyber war with Russia because the Russian government is, in many of these cases, either they're happening on Putin's orders or, like you say, Russia is doing nothing to stop them. Would you use that word, war?
I would not. I hate the term cyber war. It's a term that either movies or sometimes journalists like to use. We're not related to cyber war. People aren't dying, at least not yet, and that's good. But we are in a serious cyber, I'd say, conflict. This is something where it's become a bigger issue. It's become more dependent on these technologies, and certainly the U.S. is very vulnerable. So we need to take action. It doesn't have to be called a cyber war for us to take action. It doesn't need to be a cyber war for us to try to hold Russia accountable and work with other countries to both pressure them, and if they don't cooperate, take a range of actions from economic sanctions to diplomatic actions to even cyber actions to make sure that they are, they're not doing these things.
So, look, we just spoke to the former U.S. ambassador to Russia who said Putin hasn't changed much in the last few years. If anything, he's gotten worse. What is the biggest threat that you see? What is the worst case scenario in terms of how cyber relations could turn?
Look, Putin will only do things if it's in his interest. So right now it's been in his interest. Election interference, obviously in his interest. But all these criminal groups, even if not operating with the Kremlin's direction, are causing chaos in the West or undermining democracies in the West. That serves his underlying goal to destabilize the West more generally. So, the worst case scenario is he gets continued to do this and he does it unchecked and he steps up its game, and other countries who are waiting on the wings to see how the U.S. responds to decide to join the fray. So we need to be strong about this. We need to make sure that we're not just setting the rules of the road, but we're enforcing them. I think we can do that. And I think we can make clear that this kind of activity is not something we're going to allow to happen, but it's going to be a long road.
All right. Well, that's realistic with some optimism thrown in. Chris Painter, Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Thank you so much. Really appreciate having your expert perspective here on the show. Coming up, counting down to the Tokyo Olympics, we're going to take a look at how technology will help keep athletes safe in the wake of a global pandemic. This is Bloomberg. General Motors is raising the stakes in the electric car race. The automaker is boosting its investment in future technology for a second time in 8 months, with plans to spend $35 billion on more than 30 plug-in cars by 2025 and a total of 4 battery plants. GM also says growth in its financial lending unit will lift first-half adjusted earnings to as much as $9.5 billion. And Japan is pressing ahead with plans to hold the Olympic Games next month, despite Tokyo continuing to report up to 400 COVID cases every day. In this week's City Lab segment, we take a look at how technology will be used in the capital to keep athletes safe.
It's the countdown to the Olympics. I'm Kurumi Mori in Tokyo. Here's what you need to know. We are now 5 weeks away from Japan's unprecedented staging of the world's biggest multi-sports event amid a global pandemic. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga gained the support from G7 leaders, including President Biden, to host the Olympics next month.
こうした支持を心強く思うとともに、東京大会を何としても成功させなきゃならない、そうした思いの中で、しっかりと開会をし、成功に導なきゃならない、そういう決意を新たにいたしました。
The final communique mentioned support for holding the Games in a safe and secure manner as a symbol of global unity in overcoming COVID-19. After a year-long delay, health and safety remain top of mind. The International Olympic Committee has released a series of so-called playbooks that cover protocols for those involved, including athletes, officials, press members, and sport federations, among others. And we just got the third and final 70-page edition. Here's the latest. We know athletes and members of the media whose movements will be restricted will be under GPS monitoring for the first 14 days of their stay in Japan via a smartphone app. On top of the expected mask wearing, physical distancing, and regular testing, we get new details on how officials plan to enforce the playbook rules. All athletes and officials will be assigned CLOs, or COVID-19 liaison officers, who will help with implementing the countermeasures. And there will be a disciplinary commission. Warnings, suspensions, expulsions, disqualifications, and financial sanctions, all possible, although no specific amount has been provided. Olympians could even be kicked out of Japan for violating the COVID rules. Plus, here's what we're looking to next. What will happen to Tokyo's state of emergency? It's set to be lifted later this month, but the Japanese government is now considering placing the capital under a maenboshi, or a quasi-state of emergency during the Olympics, according to a Kyodo News report. This could impact the decision on whether or not domestic spectators will be allowed to attend the Games and in what capacity. That's it for now. I'm Kurumi Mori in Tokyo.
We'll be watching Tokyo. Coming up on the latest edition of Studio 1.0, I sit down with the co-founder of Coinbase, Fred Ursum, one of the earliest crypto adopters, who's now betting on the future of crypto at his venture capital firm, Paradigm, how he believes it could change the world, but might leave the U.S. behind. That is next. And as we head to break, Jessica Alba's Honest Company released its first earnings report since going public. First quarter sales beating estimates, but the company didn't offer any outlook on performance going forward. Shares have risen 10% since pricing early last month. This is Bloomberg. It has been a wild ride in crypto over the last few months, but the earliest crypto investors are really the ones who've seen the highest highs and the lowest lows over the last decade. On the latest edition of Bloomberg Studio 1.0, I caught up with Coinbase co-founder Fred Ursum, who got in on Bitcoin almost at the very beginning. He has since founded the crypto-focused venture capital firm Paradigm. Here's a look at part of that interview about betting on crypto, what kind of regulation he sees coming, and how China may be the biggest crypto threat to the United States.
Crypto is its own rabbit hole. And just like any new powerful technology, it's extremely powerful because it reimagines very important systems that run the world today from the ground up. Most people primarily think about crypto, again, as a new digital money. That's really worked especially with Bitcoin as a store of value, where we've seen Bitcoin go from 0 to $1 trillion in market capitalization over the last 10 years. But crypto goes much deeper than that. We think about crypto at Paradigm, which is the investment firm I've started along with Matt Huang, in 3 stages today. And of course, this model will evolve over time. The first is a new digital money. The second is a new financial system. And the third is just a broad internet application platform. So in our minds, crypto isn't just kind of this new digital money or new digital gold. It's a whole new financial system that we're seeing being built from the ground up by talented entrepreneurs all around the world. And while it's extremely early on the third frontier, a new application platform, we think that over the course of decades, a lot of internet applications that we're all using will also be crypto-based.
You now run a crypto-focused investment firm called Paradigm. How is the crypto style of venture capital different from traditional venture capital?
Yeah. Well, I think in a few ways, just to talk about why we started Paradigm in the first place, myself and Matt Huang, who was previously a partner at Sequoia, focused and running their crypto investing efforts. We realized a couple of things. One, crypto is a whole new field that needs 100% focus. The core question that Matt and I asked ourselves in starting the firm is there anybody out there who, if we were crypto entrepreneurs building a business, and Matt was a former Y Combinator startup founder, I obviously started a large crypto company in Coinbase, who would we want to have as our first backers? And we couldn't really come up with a good answer to that question. The last is, I think the expertise required both on the team and operationally in crypto is very different. So we're really trying to build a firm from an engineering and entrepreneurial point of view to best support these crypto native companies and protocols.
The crypto VC landscape is getting now more competitive. So where are you placing your bets? How do you stay ahead of the curve?
The thing we're really excited about is a number of fronts. One is the picks and shovels businesses. So now that crypto has grown a lot, there are all sorts of basic infrastructure businesses that are being built out to support that ecosystem. Those, of course, include exchanges, also custodians, tax providers, KYC AML providers, lenders, crypto backend as a service for any business that would like to integrate crypto, all sorts of these picks and shovels businesses. A second big frontier, as we talked about before, is DeFi. all of these crypto native financial building blocks that are being built out and today support around $75 billion in user assets, up from effectively zero 3 years ago. And this is sort of the bleeding edge of what we see as a whole series of crypto native applications.
I want to talk about regulation because the US government has yet to really take a stand on crypto, but President Biden's SEC has made it clear that some sort of stand is coming. What kind of regulation do you expect?
So I think the US is at a very important crossroads with crypto today. The US is blessed with the best currency and the world's reserve currency today. It also tends to be the de facto financial regulator for a whole bunch of the world. We also have a history of being the strongest technology country in the world. If you look at the most valuable companies in the world today, most of them are American internet technology companies. The Googles, the Microsofts, the Facebooks. I do think that crypto is a nuanced issue and that it's possible the US gets crypto wrong. I think today you have a lot of regulators whose job it is to mitigate risk and keep us all safe, and that's very appropriate. At the same time, I think crypto is the next internet-sized opportunity for the United States. I think it has the potential to create as many, if not more, jobs in the internet, similar with economic growth. I think it has the potential to square the circle on the privacy internet issues that we've been talking about with big tech companies for the last 10 years. Namely, we could use these technologies to continue to own our own data while still getting all the benefits of the internet platforms we know and love today.
China is taking a stand on crypto, for better or for worse, and that's also where most of the mining is happening. Do you have concerns that China is going to beat the US in crypto and that that's kind of a big deal?
Candidly, yes. Yeah, and it's on multiple fronts, to your point. One is there are government programs to explicitly build using crypto. This is true both with their DCEP initiative, which is basically making a digital renminbi. It's also true of local governments who are trying to use blockchain technology. And then to your point, historically, most crypto mining has been in China. Recently, there was actually a government crackdown in China on mining, oftentimes because energy was being siphoned from the Chinese grid in ways that may or may not have been kosher. So I think there's actually a huge moment of opportunity today for miners in the United States or globally to step in and on the crypto side to make it more decentralized. And then if you want to view it from a nation state point of view, to make sure that no single country is in control.
Coinbase and Paradigm co-founder Fred Ursum there. It is an excellent interview, fascinating. We're going to have the full length of that interview airing tonight on the latest edition of Bloomberg Studio 1.0 right here on Bloomberg Television. He'll talk about the wild ride that was and is possibly to come. Now to a few other stories we are watching. Moderna says the United States will buy 200 million more doses of its COVID-19 vaccine. The new doses will bring the total amount of Moderna shots ordered by the U.S. government to 500 million. The agreement also includes the potential for buying other COVID vaccines currently being tested, including booster shots. The company says the doses will be delivered late this year and in early 2022. Plus, an antibody cocktail made by Regeneron is showing promise. According to a study by the University of Oxford research team, the therapy reduced the risk of death among hospitalized COVID patients by 20%. Patients who got the cocktail also spent 4 days less in the hospital on average. Regeneron says the benefit was only for people whose bodies don't naturally produce antibodies. And finally, Google has won a deal to provide the French luxury goods giant LVMH with cloud-based artificial intelligence solutions. The aim? To personalize experiences for customers and foster long-term growth. Google also will work with LVMH's individual brands to help them better recommend targeted products to clients. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Make sure you tune in to Bloomberg tomorrow. My colleague David Weston will be speaking with Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan, 8 a.m. Wall Street time, 5 a.m. on the West Coast. You don't want to miss that. And of course, catch Studio 1.0 tonight. This is Bloomberg.